The bourbon whiskey boom has been incredible, but how did all this come about? Scotch-Irish settlers, chemists, French brandy, tax rebellion, prohibition, act of Congress. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive in there now. Hello, Hendo here, and welcome to 10 Defining Moments in Bourbon Whiskey. In this video we will explore where bourbon whiskey came from in more detail. The state of Kentucky is the backbone to bourbon whiskey. Here's 10 defining moments. Number 1, steamboats. Number 2, whiskey tax. Number 3, phylloxera. Number 4, charred oak barrels. Number 5, Scottish-Irish distillers. Number 6, bottled in bond. Number 7, the Taft decision. Number 8, prohibition. Number 9, 1964 Congress. And number 10, revival. So, number 1, steamboats. First commercial steamboat is 1807. 1821, the first year bourbon is mentioned in a newspaper. By then, steamboats made regular trips from Kentucky to New Orleans, St. Louis and other places on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. These were the early highways. Bourbon whiskey was born out of this trade down the rivers to New Orleans. But people in New Orleans weren't drinking whiskey from Kentucky. They drank French brandy. On these waterways, taste changed. New Orleans, hub for the Mississippi, transport east, and as America spread west, ships to California, Kentucky had more miles of navigable rivers than any other state in the Union apart from Alaska. Now, just as bartenders are influential today, back then bartenders would rent space on a steamboat, stock their bar with drinks including aged whiskey that was sold in Bourbon Street, New Orleans, which became known as Bourbon Street whiskey, then simply bourbon whiskey. These bartenders helped spread the word on the quality of Kentucky bourbon whiskey to their customers who travelled far and wide. Bourbon Street, New Orleans dates back to 1721, 300 years ago, named after France's ruling family, the House of Bourbon. The liquor name came later. The American Civil War, railroads took over from steamboats for transporting the whiskey. Number 2, defining moment, whiskey taxes. The first US tax was for spirits. Excise whiskey tax became law in 1791. For George Washington, it was to generate revenue for the war debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. The Whiskey Rebellion was a tax protest by farmer distillers who had bartered with their spirit. It was the first test of federal authority in the United States. Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801 and repealed the whiskey tax, but it returned with Lincoln for the 1812 war and permanent federal law by the American Civil War. Thomas Jefferson completed the Louisiana Purchase, a land deal securing New Orleans from the French, really important, becoming major hub for Kentucky bourbon. Taxes on whiskey paid for half the federal budget. Tennessee whiskey tax was half that of Kentucky. Today, bourbon whiskey generates hundreds of millions of dollars in state and local taxes, funding local schools, libraries and public safety. On to number 3, defining moment, phylloxera. In 1865, phylloxera, a tiny parasitic insect, devastated French vineyards, wiping out grape harvests of wine and brandy. French brandy was popular in the US, especially the French colony of New Orleans. Many in whiskey talk how it kick-started the rise of Scotch whiskey, but did the same for French Caribbean rum and jump-started bourbon's rise. The plant disease actually originated in America. European vintners imported American vines, eager to experiment with different grape varieties, unwittingly bringing in a catastrophe. Scotch caught on with the people of Europe until the 20th century's boom bust, but in the US it was a golden opportunity for bourbon whiskey. Now on to number 4, defining moment. Charred oak barrels, 1935 in law, specifically charred new oak containers. But let's go back. French brandy in new oak charred casks sold at a premium in 16th century New Orleans, going back to practices 14th century France. The name brandy comes from Dutch burnt wine, distilled wine. The French had perfected aging in barrels on long sea voyages. Chemists noted from 1757 charred casks preserved wine's brandy, imparting colour and improved the flavour of the liquor. Aging bourbon whiskey in charred oak barrels was to make it look and taste more like French brandy, increasing its value and popularity. It was less expensive than French brandy, but it felt similar in taste. In 1896, charring barrels for bourbon whiskey was universal. Coopers used staves to form 53-gallon barrel, then charred before putting in spirit to mature. New American white oak was used because it was plentiful, local, practical for transport and watertight. After Prohibition, legal requirement for using a barrel only once originated in Franklin Roosevelt's 1935 Federal Alcohol Administration Act and in 1938 New Deal, most likely a result of heavy lobbying by cooper unions and the powerful timber industry. Today, TTB defines bourbon as charred new oak containers, so it doesn't need to be American white oak or in barrels, but is industry standard. On to number 5, defining moment. Scots-Irish distillers, settlers made whisky, rye then corn. Maker's Mark Bourbon traces its whisky making back to Rob Samuels, a Scots-Irish immigrant distiller, 1780 Kentucky. Famine and Highland clearances brought Scots and Irish to the US from Philadelphia and Delaware, radiating out to Pennsylvania, Virginia and the Carolinas, but records also show Ohio, East Kentucky, moonshine in Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, the adapted sour mash, recycling batch remains to begin a new batch. 1823, Scots chemist and physician Dr. James Crowe moved from Scotland to Kentucky, is named inventor of the sour mash process, but there's no records to confirm it. The Bard family of Bardstown, Kentucky had Scottish heritage also. Number 6, defining moment. Bottled in Bond Act 1897 was arguably the first law protecting the consumer from imitation whisky. Before that, you could easily be sold whisky that had additives like caramelised sugar, prunes, or even tobacco juice, iodine and acid, rectified with various impurities. But in 1897, President Grover Cleveland signed the Bottled in Bond Act, essentially siding with the straight bourbon distillers over the rectifiers. Now meant the United States government guaranteed whisky. The spirit must be 100 proof in bottle, aged in bonded warehouse for at least 4 years. Nothing but water can be added, and it must be produced in the United States with the distillery location printed on the label. Number 7, in defining moments. The Taft Decision 1909, the Pure Food and Drug Act 1906 was introduced to protect consumers from dangers. It required accurate labelling, contents and proof. This order reserved the right to use the term straight whisky to legitimate brands and imitation to others, but it didn't mention a specific recipe for straight whisky. After months of research and study, 1909 President William Howard Taft signed off on the legal definition of all American whisky, which led to the modern whisky classification for bourbon whisky to be 51% corn in the mash. Number 8, defining moment. Prohibition 1920s, the noble experiment between 1920 and 33. Vast majority of distilleries were forced to close completely. It was a ban of manufacture, distribution, sale and non-private storage, but not alcohol consumption wasn't banned. Additionally, 3 classes of alcohol were allowed: industrial alcohol, sacramental wine and alcohol for medicinal purposes, which was a huge loophole. Gangsters and bootleggers even set up their own drugstores and pharmacy companies. In New York alone, nearly 700 new drugstores between 1921 and 22. There were more speakeasies than bars. 7 distilleries were legal in Prohibition, like Four Roses in Louisville, making industrial alcohol. We may never know if Al Capone used to store his alcohol in the Smokies. After repeal in 1933, it was tough for distillers trying to restart. Then came the Great Depression and whisky was soon rationed during World War II. American palates changed during that time. Gin and lighter, the blended whisky. Prohibition era's legacy continued to shape federal policies for decades. The 3-tier system, control states and southern dry states, all affected bourbon whisky. Now to number 9, defining moment is 1964 congressional resolution, the same year of the Civil Rights Act, designating bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States. 1958 Forlin Act, whisky taxes were pushed to 20 years instead of 8 years, buying time for overstocked industry kingpin Louis Rosenstale. Described as the most powerful figure in the distilled spirits industry, federal law had required distillers to pay taxes on whisky aged 8 years, at a point which had to be sold or destroyed. He set up the Bourbon Institute to lobby and premiumise bourbon whisky through through export. A pioneer, his competitors were forced to follow. In May the 4th, 1964, resolution passed successfully. Rosenstale, head of Shenley Distillers, was instrumental in this defining moment, but not recognised so much today because his formidable character, known bootlegging and links to crime figures. It remains US only geographical protected beverage, and in 2007 Kentucky passed a bill to celebrate our native spirit throughout September, Bourbon Heritage Month. Number 10 defining moment in bourbon is the revival. Despite the Act of Congress, bourbon was still considered a low-class drink, lost ground to lighter flavours of vodka in the 1980s. Distillers lowered proof 86 then 80 to compete with vodka and blended whiskey, but connoisseurship only grew again in the 1990s. Popularity of single malt Scotch bourbon released single barrels, an older age statement, small batch brands appeared, and standalone distilleries grew. The bourbon boom really went stratospheric in 2010 onwards. Bartenders revived in bars, advocating craft distillers in cocktails, celebrity culture, old-fashioned drinks in the Mad Men series, idolising of rare and expensive Pappy Van Winkle. Cigars came back in trend. Steakhouses, fine wines, craft beer, big rich flavours of brown spirits was back with a bang. Premiumisation, cocktail culture, gentrification of the Midwest cities and bourbon tourism has all added to that rise. That rounds off the list. Which moment was the most defining for you? Tell us your favourite thing about bourbon whiskey in the comments. Watch the other videos in the series, and if you're interested in whiskey projects, contact us at hendotalks.com. As always, welcome your feedback. I hope this was useful to you in some way, and until next time, thanks very much for watching.